Well, today we're honored to have Dr. Sean McDowell with us. Sean is an influential voice in Christian apologetics, a Biola University professor, and an author passionate about equipping the next generation to defend their faith. Sean is also the co-host of Think Biblically podcast, one of the most popular faith and culture engagement podcasts. His latest book is Apologetics for an Ever-Changing Culture, which addresses some of the biggest challenges facing Christianity today. Sean, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Candid Conversations.
My pleasure, Jonathan. Been looking forward to it.
Well, for those who may be listening, who maybe think the McDowell name sounds familiar and maybe aren't familiar with all things Sean and even Josh McDowell, give us a little bit of your background, your story, how you got into apologetics.
Sure. First off, I've been married to my high school sweetheart, and it's 25 years this spring, and we have 3 kids. So that's my
awesome
full-time job.
Love it. Yeah, there you go. Get your priorities right.
Yeah, I've been teaching 12 years at Biola University, Taub School of Theology, in the Master's in Apologetics program. Before that, I taught a decade of high school Bible in apologetics and worldview. Essentially, I'm a communicator. My heart is the next generation. Yeah. My heart is to defend the faith. So I've written books making the case for the resurrection, case for intelligent design, a biblical view for students, thinking about some of the most thorny ethical issues of our day. Yeah. And then I use Instagram and, like you said, our podcast and YouTube to just help Christians defend the faith and invite non-Christians to consider the credibility and life-changing power of Christianity.
It's amazing, and that's noble work, right? It's that's not easy, and it's thorny issues that probably a lot of Christians have not dealt with themselves, but need to be equipped with in order to engage the culture, to have helpful conversations. And so, we're really grateful for your work in that area. Well, Sean, one of the things we saw was this trend of increase in Bible sales last year, an increase of 22%, which is a massive shift. And your name came up. We said we need to talk to Sean McDowell and kind of figure out what's going on. What are all these things signaling? What do they mean? And so I guess our questions are sort of, what do you think is driving a renewed interest in Scripture? And I guess a kind of another leading question might be, do you know who's behind the purchasing of Bibles? Is it young people? Is it older people? Is it spread across different generations?
So I think you're right that this is a massive shift. It's enough to give you pause because it's not like a 2 or 3% jump.
That's right. It's not a bump, a little bump.
Yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, I'm somewhat hesitant. I think we need 2, 3, 5 years of data to really draw some kind of cultural definitive shifts from this, as opposed to some unknown factor that causes the drive. Now, as a whole, this may be a piece of a larger shift we're seeing with an openness to spiritual things.
Yes.
When you go back to the middle of the 20th century, and there's a Time cover in 1966 or 67, and it asks the question, is God dead?
Right.
And just proclaim that God was out of a job. You move into the early 21st century, the first decade, you have the new atheists just proclaiming and filling up the news that God is completely out of a job. And it's anti-science, anti-humanitarian. We're moving towards this era where God is dead and we'll be better for it.
Right.
You also had the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, of less people defining themselves. And it would seem like there's this trajectory where we're headed maybe towards Europe getting more and more secular. But this study pops up and gives us pause. Yeah. And actually, I just saw in the New York Times as well this morning that there was an article about the decline in Christianity has slowed.
Right.
And they talked about, interestingly enough, going back to 2019, how those who define themselves as nuns has either stopped or radically slowed down what it was in the past. And they pointed out in this article that it's not just, typically women are far more religious than men.
Right.
And in this case, you don't have that split.
Interesting.
It's actually men and women, boys and girls in terms of younger adults.
Yeah.
that are showing kind of less bleeding of the Christian faith, so to speak.
Yeah.
So to me, this Bible sales is one kind of bump that gives me pause and just says maybe this shift towards secularism is slowing down. I don't know that there's evidence that it's reversing.
Sure.
Although in places like the UK, we are seeing more young people going back to church than previous generations. So I guess to answer your question,
Yeah.
it's enough to give me pause.
Yeah.
It's enough to make me stop and go, something's going on here. I want to know more and see where the data leads in the next 2, 3 to 5 years.
If someone were to force you to have a response, someone who had a podcast and wanted you to give an answer, what in your line of work, what are you hearing from, experts or the people at your university? What's kind of the general, if you had to kind of start to put a couple of pinpoints, we're not going to hold you to it in 5 years if you end up being wrong, but just from your, you're obviously experienced in this. Is it cultural shifts? Is it a hunger for the word? If you had to kind of pinpoint a couple of theses, theories.
Yeah, that's
really.
totally fair. I'm happy to do that. I think part of what the New Atheists reflected, the first decade of the 21st century roughly, was this strong reaction against Christianity in particular. Well, that only works if you have a generation of people that at least know or think they know what Christianity is and are hurt or angered or disillusioned by it.
Yes.
Well, now we have these new voices, people like Barry Weiss and Tom Holland and Jonathan Rauch and Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
It's as if these secular voices are rediscovering the Christian worldview and saying things like Jordan Peterson did. And he may be a Christian now. I'm not exactly sure how to take his terms, but he's certainly far more favorable to it.
Yeah.
He said things like it's the basis of Western civilization and the impetus for science.
Yeah.
I mean, Jonathan Rauch, a gay atheist, said in the New York Times maybe 3 months ago that America quite literally needs Jesus to survive and flourish. Now, he doesn't mean that in the way you and I think we need Jesus. But that's a completely different tune than what we're used to hearing.
Yeah.
So I think there's a combination of a generation that's been raised up without religious roots, but also without religious baggage.
Yeah.
And there's a deeper hunger. There's a deeper brokenness, relationally and spiritually brokenness. There's mental health concerns. There's division in our culture. And I think there's a leaning into wonder. And so Rod Dreher, who's a New York Times columnist, he's Catholic, had a book come out, came out in February, and it's called Believe. And he said in the past 10 to 15 years, in his audience, there's been a shift towards more of a curiosity about spiritual things, and an interest and an openness that wasn't there. Rod Dreher, an Orthodox writer, wrote a book called Living in Wonder. And he talks about how even interest in UFOs and psychedelics hints at a deeper spiritual yearning that's taking place in our culture. So I think that's what's going on. Now, everybody's not turning to Christianity and buying Bibles. I think that's one interest, but we're seeing this spiritual interest and I think an awareness that secularism is dead and it can't fulfill the deepest yearning of the human heart, let alone save civilization.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've had Michael Horton on, who's written Spiritual But Not Religious. There's this fascination, intrigue, interest in the spiritual world. And so it could kind of explain, let's try some different things. And so there's probably going to be a little bit of, there's a bump and increase in Bible sales. And some people are going to, come to that and say, oh, I found my answer. This is my new thing. Some people might say, not sure if that's my thing. But I guess here's where I'm curious for the believer who's listening to this. How do you use that to your advantage in terms of you're coming at this as an apologist? Which is interesting because an apologist is about the argument, making a defense. We're almost like the tables have turned. You're not necessarily having to make a defense. You're actually making a presentation for someone who's already potentially has high interest in what you have to say. We believe in the sovereignty of God, of course, but he uses his people. And if his ambassadors are going out and they're ill-equipped and they don't know how to articulate actually what the gospel is, and they don't know how to say these sorts of things and have answers to some of their questions, that'll be a tremendous disservice to what could potentially be a great shift in kind of Western society. So from your perspective, how do you help fill in some of those gaps?
Something I've been thinking about a lot and have tried to pivot and realize that I think I have a ways to go is there's still a tendency, I think, among apologists and voices in the church to speak as if we're addressing the new atheist still, when that movement died a decade ago.
Right. That's right.
I don't think they represent most atheists. I don't think most people are angry at the church, trying to take down Christianity,
Right.
Writing books how God isn't great and it's a delusion.
Right.
I think most people have issues with the church, or they be Christians, fine.
Yeah.
I think most people are more just curious, though.
Yeah.
And so if our posture would shift a little bit and just be like, let's have a conversation.
Yes.
Let me ask you some questions.
Yeah.
Then I think we could make a lot more headway and be heard more than the kind of culture war dialogue that so characterized our response to the new atheist.
Yeah.
Now, with that said, is there a time and place to call out certain nonsense prophetically? Of course there is. Of course. But for most people, I think this indicates there's a spiritual openness, there's a curiosity. And if we just do what Jesus did, which is asking questions, the Gospels and Acts, we have recorded 340 questions that Jesus asked.
Yeah.
In Paul's letters, 262 questions. So what if we as Christians got better at just making arguments and just listening to people and inviting conversation and then sharing who Jesus is, how he's changed our lives, what the gospel is?
Yeah.
I think we get a greater reception and interest than we even can imagine.
As we wrap up the first part of our conversation with Dr. Sean McDowell, we've explored some fascinating insights about the significant increase in Bible sales and what this might indicate about our cultural moment. Join us for part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Sean McDowell on Candid Conversations. Until then, thank you for listening to Candid Conversations. If you found this conversation helpful, please share it with someone who might benefit. Subscribe so you never miss an episode, and leave a review so others can find us. We'll see you next time.